this is Wayne Lytle from Animusic. Welcome to the Director's Commentary. By way of introduction, let me start out by explaining what Animusic is. The name, of course, comes from combining the words animation and music, or animated music. The music is all created digitally with synthesizers, and the visuals are all 3D computer-generated animation. The goal is to give the impression that the graphical instruments are playing the music you hear. The music drives the computer animation, not the other way around. In order to do this, we run the MIDI files through a bunch of custom software which analyzes each note in its place and time and determines how each instrument element should move to appear to be playing the music. MIDI, spelled M-I-D-I, stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. It lets synthesizers and computers talk to each other and specify exactly when each note happens, how loud it is, which instrument it plays on, and various other musical characteristics. When a synthesizer receives MIDI signals through its cable, it produces a sound for each given note. And when we take MIDI files of those notes and route them into some other piece of software, we can do all kinds of interesting, unconventional stuff with that data, such as use it to drive the motion of graphical instruments. And that's how Animusic is done in a nutshell. I should mention that this triple neck electric guitar here is the most complex instrument on the entire video album. It's actually a combination of a 2-string bass, a 3-string guitar, a 4-string guitar, a pipe organ-like flute thing, a set of bass laser guns on the left firing out those blue lasers, and a wrist-fired laser bundle gun firing the green lasers out of the right, all in one, and not to mention the plasma ring sort of blue bass thing in the intro. It's complex partly because it's several instruments rolled into one, and partly because of how they're combined. In particular, the electric guitars are each controlled by their own robot hand, yet they share a common pick mechanism down below. So producing this particular element set meant creating a third virtual instrument out of the 2 guitar parts, and that third virtual instrument was the pick player down below. So we had up top a 3-string melodic line guitar fingering method, that's the middle fretboard, and then on the right a 4-string bar chord fingering method, and then down on the bottom, a 7-string picker that knew where each of the 7 strings were and how to pick both melodic lines and to play power chords. And that was all done in software, of course, through changing lots of parameters and having different parameter sets live at different times. This is probably my favorite shot on the entire video album here, where the vibes play and the bass, drum, snare, and ride do this cool pattern against each other. I really like this part. By the way, let me mention that the static noise you hear at the beginning of the introduction when the amps are first turned on, it's not a problem with your TV or stereo, and it's not a bad mix. It's not a bad sound encoding either. It's actually sound effects for noisy amplifiers and high voltage lights and lasers, etc. And this may be obvious to you, but some people have pointed out with some concern that I may have a problem with my mix. Be that as it may, the static sounds are actually intentional. And, by the way, the same is true of the static sound effects at the beginning of the last piece, harmonic voltage. The star of this piece is clearly the 1-string bass instrument, which some have called Mr. Bassman. I call it the stick. There's actually a very cool real instrument out there called the Chapman stick. The most common model has 10 strings. and you play it by tapping your fingers on the strings, like this guy does, except, well, his fingers are metal mallets and he only has one finger on each hand. But anyway, on a stick, when you tap the string, it starts to vibrate at that note, and the vibration is picked up by an electronic pickup, similar to that on an electric guitar, and then it's amplified. When people initially see the stick in this animation, usually first they laugh, and then they say it's cool, and after a few moments they ask, would that really happen? Would it really make a sound like that when the string was hit? Absolutely. And if you're not sure, get a friend's bass guitar, turn the amp up to 10, and hit a string with a hammer. You'll see. I actually wrote the music used for this animation, as well as the previous one, a few years ago, and I had no intention at the time of using either piece to visualize with Animusic. Although I'd been working with music animation since about 1989, I hadn't done any stringed instruments yet. Lots of drums and lasers and bouncy things, but no strings. So it seemed to be an insurmountable obstacle, since this had a stick bass, a guitar, upright string bass, violas. The last piece, of course, had the triple neck electric guitar, the bass guitar. But when we added vibrating strings to the visual repertoire, it opened up all kinds of possibilities. And in fact, 5 of the 7 pieces on this video album use stringed instruments to some extent. So anyway, in this case, the music was written and produced literally years before the graphical objects were modeled and the motion algorithms applied. This isn't always the case, and I'll point out some other pieces where we built the graphical instruments and stages before I'd written any final music at all. It actually can go either way, and I should probably explain a bit about that since I said earlier that the music drives the graphics. What I mean is this. Although the music drives the graphics, the music can be changed at any time up until the graphics is actually rendered, meaning the frame is generated by the computer. Remember that animation consists of a series of static images shown in rapid succession, in this case about 30 frames a second. So we can model instruments, build stages, rate the lighting, even set up some cameras before finalizing the music. And what we sometimes do is we just have test music that exercises the instruments by playing through some scales that might go through their whole note range, or hitting chords, trying long and short note durations, loud and quiet, whatever, just to see how things are working, kind of verify that the graphical instrument is behaving in the way that we want it to as it's being triggered by the note data. Then, at the last minute, before the final render actually starts, we can throw a whole other piece of music at it if we want, and it automatically animates the instrument objects according to the new note data and renders the animation. Now, there's some constraints to this process, of course. The assumption is that we're giving it music on the same set of instruments as was used for the test, or organized in the same tracks in the sequencer. We're using the same range of notes that was used in the test. Obviously, if we built a 24-note instrument and we played 27 different notes, the instrument would just ignore the top 3, so we have to be consistent here. A comment about these horns. Horns obviously don't look like this. These horns are more like part of a pipe organ or a theater organ, really. In this case, driven by air blowers under the stage, which you can't see. I'm just kind of telling you that they're there. Obviously, horns don't move like this either. Real horns don't squash and stretch when they play. So why do we do it here? It may be obvious, but I'll say it anyway. If we didn't, they wouldn't move at all. That wouldn't be any fun. A lot of times we have to exaggerate, if not create something that's totally not there at all, in order to visualize a certain sound. What about lasers? What sound do real lasers make? I've seen a lot of lasers in labs and stuff, and they didn't seem to make much sound at all. But these lasers do. They're a special kind, I guess. This is the most mellow piece of the video album and instrumentally the most simple by far. There's one single instrument, although it obviously has several parts to it, so it's actually 5 instruments combined into one. The reason I like to watch this one is that it's so clean and simple and easy to follow. You can see each note without any distraction by other instruments, at least until the other parts come in. It's even cleaner on the Solocam version since the cameras don't move at all there. I actually like watching the Solocams more than the finished pieces sometimes. This is one example of a piece that was modeled and rigged with music animation algorithms before the music was complete. Once the music was written and produced, giving us a final MIDI file, then we could render the final animation. Up until that point, we've been doing lots of tests of 5 to 10 second music clips, just to verify that the harp and all the other parts were functioning properly. The water took us about 3 weeks to get right, if you can believe that. We fiddled endlessly with parameters until it finally looked right. In the end, we ended up using 3 different water surfaces combined together. One was for reflection of the harp and environment, one was for refraction of the pebbles and underwater lights, and one was for the actual water surface with dancing highlights. Speaking of lighting, the main A section has warm yellow lights above the water, while the B section primarily uses underwater lighting for a more cooler blue look. I should point out that the harp, flute, and chimes are all aligned in terms of their notes. The string that plays a C will be directly aligned with a flute above that also plays a C, and a chime underneath plays a C as well. On top of that, the parts tend to be in unison, so flutes and chimes play their notes at the same time as when the string is plucked below or above. The last thing I'll mention about this animation is about the environment that we're in. It feels like it's outdoors, kind of, especially looking up at the stars and the moon, but those are self-illuminating paintings, not really the outdoors. This is a completely enclosed inner room, no doors or windows, blending paintings that have a nighttime outdoor feel. The stars are kind of like those in a planetarium in that they're on a dome ceiling, and these stars actually emit their own light, as if holes were poked in a fabric and a bright light was shining from behind. Drum Machine starts out with sets of gears that are animated not to actual notes, but instead to the clock beat itself, which starts a while before the first note is ever played on the hi-hat. To make an analogy, it's more like a person tapping their foot to music rather than actually playing an instrument. It's still MIDI-driven animation, using the same software, but it's just a different algorithm than we use. There are also numerous sets of normal gears that are note-driven like the rest of the instruments on the video album, and these gears are, controlling mallets and sticks and whatever hitting the drums. But the whole time that's going on, regardless of what else is happening in the music, there are always 2 sets of beat-driven gears grinding away. You can usually see them moving in the background. They're synced to that big gear grinding sound. These sets each move in one of 2 different ways. There's a downbeat group, mostly the giant gears, and then an upbeat group, which are mainly made of gears that are the next size smaller. One pattern that they use, sort of split between 2 halves of the group, is for the gears to basically oscillate back and forth, to kind of rock. The other pattern is for them to advance on each beat, sort of like a counter. One unique characteristic of this animation is that there are no cuts. It's all one camera the whole way through. We basically transition from one view to another, usually smoothly, but with an occasional whiplash move thrown in like that. I should probably also explain the somewhat bizarre lighting situation going on here. What you basically have is a strobe going off on each crash symbol, and on top of that, you get these red warning lights going on like they have in factories when heavy stuff is moving around, and that's because the timpani and os percussion is coming down on these chains and gear wheels running down side tracks on the wall. So there we just shifted gears into a faster tempo. Having the gears smoothly shift from one tempo to another, integrated with the sound effects, took more effort than I even want to talk about, but I'm really happy with how it finally came out. So this piece had a working title of Gear World for most of its existence, for obvious reasons, and is another example of an instrument configuration that was modeled and rigged with music animation algorithms before the music was in place. Once everything was set, the pressure was on me to actually write the music to drive this thing. And as with all our other environments, there's an extent to which this approximates some reality and another extent to which it violates physics in our universe. In this case, even though the structure may look somewhat physically plausible, I suspect that if you built this thing, it just might collapse under its own weight. And even if it didn't, it certainly would be difficult to move the large gears as fast and suddenly as being done here. But in the Animusic universe, that's all okay. Well, here we are in Pipe Dream, which originally had a working title of Bounce. In a way, it's a sequel to the first full music animation ever produced back in 1990 called More Bells and Whistles. In that video, the musical fountain played by ball bearings fired out of a central spout was a big hit, so I decided to build an entire environment around that concept. This piece is probably the best example of why the music animation technique we use is not what's referred to as real time. In a real-time music visualization system, you'd react to notes played right at the moment when they're played, or even with some delay. But this doesn't let you do any pre-motion, any animation of an element leading up to the note starting. The problem with real-time systems is that since no matter how fast a computer is, you can't predict the future, you don't know what pre-motion to animate before the note starts playing. Once the note starts, it's already too late. Using this piece as an example, you need to know what note is coming up before you can fire a ball bearing out of the tube to hit the element that makes the note. In effect, you need to know the future, at least for a fixed window into the future of like a couple seconds or so. So we need to know that info, which is provided in the MIDI file, in order to see what notes are coming up, as well as what notes are currently sounding and what notes have ended in the recent past. We really need all three of those. An example of notes in the past being important is the follow-through motion of, say, swing cymbals or vibrating strings, oscillating vibes and chimes. Of course, that aspect of motion could be done by a real-time system, as long as the rendering was fast enough, but that takes us to the second part of why this isn't real-time. Computer graphics images take a while to generate by the computer if you have objects of a certain complexity and a certain number of lights, etc. Generally, the more polygons used to construct the object and the more lights, especially if they cast shadows, and the more complex the surface pattern is, the longer it takes to generate or render the image. So depending on complexity and also the processor speed of the computer, these images can take anywhere from 5 minutes to a half an hour each. There's about 30 frames a second for NTSC video, actually 29.97, but who's counting? So multiply that out and that's a lot of render time. This is why computer graphics production facilities have large render farms of computers that do nothing other than render 24/7. You may be wondering why there are dents on the wall and on the floor where street balls must have hit? And I think the answer is probably that this thing didn't always work perfectly well during prototyping, testing, and practice. There were lots of misfires. But by now, the bugs have all been worked out, or at least this was a good take. This is the first complete animation Dave and I did for this video album, but rather than discussing the fine details of this animation, I think I'll use the time during this piece to outline the general approach we took to this entire production. For each piece, I'd begin by communicating to Dave my overall vision as well as certain parameters for the instruments. I'd either have already produced the music or I would at least know what synthesizer sounds I was planning on using and what the corresponding graphical instruments would look like, generally. Usually along with a verbal description, I'd scribble some rough sketches of instrument elements and or stages for Dave, and then he'd do some real sketches of sort of themes and variations on those ideas. I'd then comment on his sketches, telling him which ones were like what I was looking for and which ones were maybe pretty cool ideas, but just not what we were going for in this particular piece, etc. And after a few iterations, we'd have some general plans for what we wanted to build in 3D. Dave was usually anxious to jump right into the 3D software and start prototyping stuff, since it's easy to visualize and change things around that way, so that's usually what ended up happening next. Before too long, even with individual instrument elements, for example here maybe one of those dulcimer note elements, we'd rig it up with music animation algorithms and see how it moved when we threw some test note data at it. I'd tell Dave which algorithms to use, and then usually I'd come in and tweak the parameters endlessly until it moved like I wanted it to. Once we had an individual element of a certain instrument that was working nicely, Dave would then replicate it in the 3D software over a range of sizes, and then start hooking them into some kind of support structure or stage. Of course, then we tune the parameters so low and high notes behave differently in the correct way, throwing more test music at it, and so on. The actual stage or set sometimes came way later. For example, that's the way it was with this piece, but other times it was an integral part of the design from the beginning. The drum machine comes to mind as an example of that. But regardless of when the stage came about, at some point we'd need to light the scene, so I discussed the different parts of the music with Dave. And sometimes we'd have a fairly constant lighting setup throughout a piece, but other times there'd be different lighting scenarios for different sections. Dave would set up lights, and I'd ask for like more warmth or more backlighting or more contrast between this and that, whatever. And we'd iterate through a lot of tests before ending up with appropriate lighting. Lastly, at least from a logical perspective, the order wasn't always exactly like this. We do the cameras. We tried a lot of different approaches here, but it was always collaborative in some way. At least one or more times, I divided the music up into sections and then had Dave come up with his best guess of what some good camera angles might be, perhaps with a move for some of them. And at other times, I'd start out making some cameras and then I'd pass them off to him. So either way, we'd end up rendering the entire piece with a set of cameras, usually just to see how it flowed, and then come up with a whole other set of cameras and timings. Sometimes we kept a lot of them, sometimes we threw most away, but they always evolved quite a bit. I should mention something about the approach we've taken to the cameras, since they tend to be generally smooth in motion and usually medium to long shots, not many close-ups. And some people have commented on this, suggesting that perhaps we should use faster and more exciting camera moves and more close-ups. We've actually tried this a number of times, and I found that faster moves certainly feel more exciting, but you also lose the correlation between the instruments and the music. You don't follow the notes as much anymore. It's like, I'm flying, I'm on a roller coaster. What, there are musical instruments playing somewhere? So it doesn't really work as well, I don't think, as just a more gentle, calm motion approach to the cameras. Similarly with close-ups, which we do use sometimes, you can see one instrument clearly at the expense of losing the context of what everything else is doing. So there's a lot of trade-offs, but at least that's the explanation of why the cameras are the way they are. You know, there's another drawback of doing so many long shots as we have here, and that is the level of detail pushes what you can really resolve on a TV screen. And in fact, it turns out that this material is really difficult to encode in MPEG-2 for DVD, probably for that reason. In fact, some encoding facilities didn't want to touch it. The guy who finally ended up encoding it was Brian McGuire at Video Encoding, who did zillions of tests with all kinds of setting tweaks before ending up with what we have here. Thanks, Brian. This piece, like the first one, opens with electric, staticky kind of sound effects that are actually digital recordings of very high voltage generators and cables. Several sounds were combined together to produce the final high voltage effect. This is a very high voltage environment and also very high up in the air, probably on an alien planet or something. This set of musical instruments is by far the most abstract on the video album. They're the most unlike conventional instruments. Many of the previous animations had fairly literal musical instruments. They weren't exactly like real existing instruments, but they were enough reminiscent of existing ones that you kind of knew what to expect as far as how they moved and played. The percussion here is recognizable as such, but everything in this environment is light emitting. The lasers here behave in a more complex way than the lasers in the earlier pieces that were basically straight line, back and forth motion kind of things. Here we have this sort of double laser effect with a spirographic pattern in the middle, traveling up and down non-parallel sets of rails. And they oscillate to depict vibrato. They get larger and smaller and change color slightly based on volume and intensity. These bass emitters are plasma filled, or maybe they're filled with some kind of radioactive grape juice or something, I'm not sure. But anyway, they visualize the Taurus bass pedals part. Taurus bass pedals are a classic Moog synthesizer that's played with your feet, usually for bass parts. I don't use real Taurus bass pedals here for the soundtrack, just a synth that kind of reminds me of the same sound that they make. By far the most abstract object in this entire video album is what we call the light curtain. It's the thing back there that kind of looks like psychedelic smoke rising up. Every part of the music needs to be visualized, and the light curtain depicts the chorused strings, synth chords in the background that you hear. Each chord has a unique painted graphics image called a texture map, which slowly crawls up the light curtain. This is a subtle ambient effect in how it's tied in with the music, and you don't necessarily pick it up the first time you watch it, but it's there to ensure that each part in the music is visualized in some way. This is a second kind of laser that follows an electric guitar-like sound. And as an aside, for anyone who's curious, there aren't any real guitars on this entire video album. They're all synthesized and processed in certain ways to sound like electric guitars, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the context. The yellow voltage spikes that we have going on here are a little different than some of the other instruments in that every note is actually depicted by four separate objects. First of all, we've got a mirrored pattern happening, so each note appears both on the left and on the right, and in addition, we've got an echo. So each object pair then happens again, dimmer when the echo happens. This is the oldest piece of music on the video album. It's been remade at least once and has had a working title of WCS2 and more recently Electric. The original mix was done on a British-made analog mixing console onto DAT. Then years later, that mix was dumped into a digital audio sequencing program and enhanced with a crisper bass line for the bass tower sounds and the yellow voltage spikes, using a digital synth that didn't exist at the time that the original music was produced. Then the MIDI file was dug up, and that was used to drive the animation. In the end, after an all-digital remix, it all syncs up. This is my other favorite shot coming up here, where the four light beams rise up as we modulate to a new key. In a way, this is kind of the climax of the whole video album. This piece is the last on the video album for more than one reason. First of all, it just sort of fits as the last piece musically, I think. Sort of leaves you out there somewhere. But another reason is the fact that it is the most abstract. It's less obvious initially how the instruments work, and seeing the other animations kind of convinces you about the synchronization of Animusic, so you're more prepared for this one. Some people have told me that they didn't really get this one initially, but after watching it a few times, it became their favorite.
Well, it's been over 2 years since that last sentence. This is the commentary update for the special edition. We just wanted to thank everyone for buying our first DVD and for all the great feedback you've been sending. We do read all of it, and it's very encouraging, so thanks very much. We're hard at work on Animusic 2, and we'll try not to take so long this time, but we'll see. Thanks for listening. Wayne Lytle signing off, over and out.